As part of the EXR toolset that was put into Mamba from version 2, there's a new feature called the spatialKeyer. What the spatialKeyer allows us to do is to take advantage of some of the metadata that CGI software can provide as part of its render. And we can use the spatialKeyer on its own to generate alpha channels using that metadata. Or in fact, the color grader actually has a spatialKeyer built into it. So if we briefly start with this EXR file by just looking at the layer sets, we can see that there are a number of passes in this particular render. But in fact, only one of them is a picture render, this RGB layer here. For example, this layer is a normals pass, which actually indicates, rather than color, it indicates which direction a particular surface is facing in. But we'll come back to that. What the spatial isolation keyer allows us to do is to make selections based on that metadata. So, for example, if I went to the Object ID folder and told it to look at the Object ID metadata, this is where the CGI software has given each object in the scene a different numeric ID, then I can create alpha channels based purely on picking an object. As you can see, as I pick around, an alpha channel is generated for the object that I've picked. In this case, I've picked the bowl itself. So to look more practically at the various things we can do, what I'm actually going to do is not use the spatialKeyer on its own, but rather I'm going to use it with a color grade, just so I can highlight the selections I'm making. And as I mentioned, if we look in the subfolders of any given vector in the color grade, we'll see there's now a new multi-layer subfolder, and it in fact has all the details that are in the spatialKeyer. So this just allows us to shortcut to a position of making a selection to change a color, whereas the spatialKeyer on its own makes a selection to create an alpha channel with which we can then do anything else we want to do. One additional item in the multi-layer tab in here is the external key folder. This is for a particular workflow where you might have been provided with an EXR file that has an image channel, but also multiple pre-made masks, perhaps rotoscoping, and they're all embedded in the same file. So this allows you to access them easily here. But for this tutorial, we're going to look at the CGI data that we've got in this EXR render. So let's start by just changing the color. And of course, at the moment, it's changing the color of everything because I haven't used the selection, for example, a window like this, which would otherwise restrict that particular layer's color corrector. Instead, I'm going to use the selections that are made from the multi-layer tab. So firstly, let's look at what we can do with the object ID. So the first thing to do is to tell it which of the channels from the EXR file provide the relevant data for the object ID. And in this, it's easily called this one. So from now, I can just go to the multi-layer tab and make sure pick object is on. And now whatever I pick is going to inherit that color correction, even including objects that are masked. And they will happily, of course, all follow any moving objects because that's what the object ID mask is doing. It's also worth noting that this object ID mask may not be anti-aliased, in which case often just adding a little bit of key blur wouldn't go amiss. So let's be tidy and let's keep these named. Call that green ball, and I'm just going to duplicate that layer. Let's call this one blue ball. So on this one we'll just give this a different grade, and of course using our pick object we'll just pick a different ball, maybe that one. So now we've got two layers of grading going on for those objects. So let's move on and look at the other options within the spatialKeyer section. So layer, add layer, and again let's just throw some grade on it. So in this one, let's go down to position and see what we've got in here. So the position selector relies on having X, Y, and Z data coming from the render, and I have it here in a position. So what this has done is rather than give R, G, and B data for each pixel in order to give us the color of that pixel, actually the CGI software has instead passed X, Y, and Z. So now Mamba can know where everything is. So if I select this as the layer set, and I'm just going to make my selection a bit bigger, you can see that if I go to multi-layer and pick position, you can now see I've got a spot that's following me around. Let's make that bigger still so you can see what we're doing. So because Mamba knows exactly where all these objects are, you can see I'm picking the objects in 3D space. The reason it's circular is what effectively is happening is there's a sphere, as we can see here, or it could be a box. So imagine an invisible ball in the scene that I'm moving around, and wherever it intersects an object, that's where we get the selection. So let's move that here, make it bigger, make it softer, and we'll have that as some glow or something going on inside there. And again, neat and tidy, call that glow. So let's add another layer and look at something else. So again, going back down into our multi-layer tab, I'm going to skip depth, I'm going to come back to that. I've got directional light here. So again, just so we can see it, I'm just going to put some grade, which of course is overall at the moment because I haven't picked anything. So what the directional light will latch onto are the normals. So what normals are is it's a way of describing which direction a particular face faces in, as in is it a floor, is it a wall, what is its angle to the world. So I'm going to select that as the layer set from which the directional light will get that data, and again go into multi-layer, and this time I'm going to pick direction. So now what you can see is it'll actually pick surfaces that are common in terms of the direction they face. So you can see as I switch between this wall, which is facing that way, and this surface which is facing upwards, you can see this floor is changing as well because this is facing upwards as well. So as I move around the bowl, you can see that I'm changing, if you like, the direction of the light. Probably the easiest thing is if I push it around the side of the ball. So this is quite a good effect for being able to subtly relight an image. You can see as I move from side to side how the shadows appear to be moving inside the bowl from one side to the other. So for example, I could use it to just pop underneath these balls in order to bring up the shadows a little bit so they aren't quite so dark. So going back, let's add another layer, and let's just go back to the depth that I skipped earlier because I wanted to do it last. So the depth selector will take a depth map from wherever it comes from. In this case it's CGI software, so I'm going to select it here. So a depth map is basically a black to white image where the luminance value for a given pixel suggests how far away from the camera it is. So let's again just put in a grade just so we can see what we're doing. Then on multi-layer, select by depth and make a pick. And you can see that what I've got is a dark shadow of a given width that's sliding up and down through the image. The width is set here. And you can see as I move it up and down, it'll intersect the balls. And there's two ways of working with it. Effectively, the select distance and off-focus distance are an invert of each other. The reason being, if we use the off-focus version, we can use this to create simple depth of field effects. So what I'm going to do is reduce that down, soften out the edges, and then in my color grader, rather than a color correction, I'm going to instead just add in some blur. So now using the depth pick, I can pick what is in focus. Pull that a bit more to make it more obvious, and perhaps also maybe we'll just take the saturation down as well. So you can see as I slide around we can be pulling focus backwards and forwards. So going back to what we started with, you can see that using the spatial isolation-Keyer toolset gives us a huge amount of control. Of course, this is supposing that we have the metadata provided to us, either by a CGI render or by other processes. But that data is generally readily available from CGI renders.